discovering the problem, the first thing that you want to know is who your audience is. Ultimately, they are going to craft the narrative and the analysis that you're going to be doing. And this is important because different people want to see different things from the same data. Let's say you were to take some sales data. Now, the board might say, what I want is to predict next quarter's sales. I'm not interested in what's happening right now. The future is what is important. But person who heads a product team might be asking the question, I'm curious which product grew the most. It's looking backwards, and it's not at an aggregate level, but it's at a comparison level between products. The head of sales might be curious, did we meet our target? And specifically, who met their targets, who did not, which again is a comparison, but not within the data, but with an external benchmark outside of that raw data set. So these are three different people looking at the same data set and asking very, very different questions. Unless you know who it is that this is meant for, you are not going to be able to figure out the answer because they are not interested in each other's questions. Now, you might assume, why would we not know this? The reason is because typically any one of these people would give a project to a project manager and say, what we want to do is put together a sales dashboard, or what we want to do is get sales analytics. Now, when they say sales analytics, the board really means prediction. Product head really means growth comparison. Sales head really means target comparison. But they all will tell the project manager, what we want is sales analytics. Here's the data, get the answer. And if you solve the wrong person's question, then you haven't solved the problem. And it's fairly easy to find out who the audience is. All you need to do is ask two questions. What is the audience's role? And here, try and be specific, something like head of sales rather than just a senior executive. And what's their name? Get the specific person's name. So, if, for example, the audience is a product head, there may be a dozen product heads. Write down the name of one product head, because then you at least have one concrete person, and you could always reach out to the project manager and say, okay, let's assume that the person's name is Jim. Is this really important for Jim? Do you know this? Do you not know this? We'll have somebody to refer to and we can find out more about them. There is a whole field around creating personas and understanding personas, and this is an entry point into that. But without going into the details of that, if you just know that your audience is Jim Fry, the head of sales, then that's a huge step forward. The second thing then is to look at what their problem is, and that really is what defines your analysis. Oh, to do this, you need to write a sentence which answers four questions. First, given the person, and this is the same person that you have identified in the previous exercise, which is a name and a role, what is their current situation? What problem or what problems are they facing? What is an action that they can take? And what is the impact of this action? Let me give you an example. Let's say there's John, the head of marketing. This is the person and their role. John, the head of marketing, must create a region wise budget. That's a problem or that's a situation that he is in, that he doesn't have a budget across regions. What is the problem that he's facing? The problem is that he doesn't know what the region wise return on investment is. They're putting in money, but they're not sure whether they're getting enough return out of it. That's the problem he's trying to solve. Now, once he has this, what action can John take? Well, John can prioritize by region. Which regions are getting a high ROI? Which regions are getting a low ROI? And focus on the regions that have a poor ROI. So, and what is the impact of this action? By focusing on the regions that have a poor ROI, he can actually improve the overall ROI, maximize it. So, in other words, for the money that's coming in into the marketing department, he is going to be able to get more out of it by prioritizing, for which he needs to solve the problem of getting the region wise ROI. And that's in the context of the new region wise budget creation exercise. The structure of a sentence like this is, this person in this role is in such a situation and faces this problem. By taking this action, he or she can drive this kind of an impact. Let's see this in real life. Let me take the example that I talked about, the commodities president. So, the the head of commodities in this company, let's call them John. John, the head of commodities, the VP of the president of commodities, must. And what's their situation? Their situation is that they need to predict the commodity price, must predict viscose price. What is their problem? The problem is they don't know when to sell. So, John, the president of commodities, must create a viscose price forecast because they need to know when to buy and when to hold and when to sell viscose. What is the action they can take? By holding when prices will rise or selling when prices will fall, he can maximize the price realization, effectively getting more revenue for free. Ideally, this is something that should be quantified. The impact should be X million dollars or X thousand dollars or whatever is the currency. In the case of the commodities company that I talked about, when we did a quick quantification, it ended up saving them potentially around $2 million every year at the very least. Let's take another example. I'm going to talk about a steel company, an energy company, and they wanted to improve their operational efficiency. That was a stated problem. But once we started doing this exercise, it turned out that the real need was actually quite different. It turned out that they needed to spot fraud. Let me take you through how this worked out. So initially, they came to us with this problem. They said, help us discover how to improve our operational efficiency using data. But then we said, let's go through the process. Step one, who's the audience? Manish, who heads a state electricity board. We asked Manish, what's your situation? He said, our electricity board is looking to reduce manpower and therefore improve the efficiency. Got it? That's your situation. What's your problem? He said, well, the reason we are not able to reduce manpower is because the unions are not giving in. So we said, okay, good. Then what we're specifically looking for is ways in which we can help the union understand that reducing manpower is what they ought to be doing. And that led to another topic. We said, with this kind of data, what can you do? He said, well, see, the union has not really responded well to any kind of data we show them. For example, every piece of information that we share comes back with from them saying, look, this is 100,000 people strong unit. And what we need is something that is substantial. This data is just not big enough. But one thing that would really help establish the case is if we could demonstrate fraud, in which case that will open up a lot of scenarios. We've had a few cases where, for example, the meter readings were cooked up by the people, but the union said, how many data points do you have? 10 data points, 100 data points? We're 100,000 people. So it needs to be substantial. So he said, if we can convincingly show the unions that there was a high level of fraud, that's a concrete action that I can take. And the impact would be that the board gets a lot of power to negotiate and reduce manpower, especially in the areas that have high fraud. So, what started off as an improving an operational efficiency problem ended up becoming a fraud problem, completely different from what we had originally. In fact, this led to some pretty surprising results. We found that if we look at the histogram of the number of units consumed, this is in one particular region, then the number of people consuming very few units is relatively low. Number of people consuming beyond 200 or 300 units is very low. It's mostly concentrated in the 50 to 100 bucket. But the unusual thing is that there are spikes. The biggest spikes, that is, there's a huge number of people consuming 50 units or 100 units or 200 units or even 300 units. And these are exactly the slab boundaries, meaning if somebody consumed 101 units, then their electricity bill suddenly shoots up, not just unit incrementally, but the entire base is built at a higher slab. So clearly there's a strong economic incentive for people to keep their meter readings at 100 or less. And there are a couple of ways that can happen. One, everybody's very carefully monitoring the meter readings, and the instant it hits 100, they turn off all their lights and fans and there's no more electricity for the rest of the month. Yeah, theoretically possible. Or more realistically, there's a certain amount of corruption and fraud involved. They pay off the person who's reading the meter, and that person puts in a round number, of 100 just at the slab boundary. So this was able to demonstrate, firstly, the extent to which fraud exists in each of the regions, and secondly, where the fraud was concentrated. But that apart, this also showed something else that was surprising. There were spikes not just at 50 and 100, which were the slab boundaries, but also at 10, 20, 30, 40, 60, 70, 75, and so on, round numbers. And this made no sense because why would anyone pay to round off a number, especially when there is no economic incentive here? But that Manish was able to interpret in a very different way. He said, what you're showing me is a different kind of situation. This is not fraud, this is laziness. See, what happens is people don't often go to these houses to take the meter readings. They sit in office and they cook up numbers. And when people cook up numbers, they cook up round numbers. So what you're seeing here is a very different phenomenon, which I wasn't looking for, but now gives me even further evidence to demonstrate that not only uh, is the organization corrupt, at least in certain areas, but is also lazy and not following the protocol. And we have a strong incentive to go for automated meter readings. Let's take another example. This was an education department. Their stated problem was we want to use data analysis to improve the school performance. The person we were talking to was Sabita, the education secretary. And their situation was the press and opposition were criticizing the student performance, which had not been really improving. And what they wanted to do was see how they could address it. But when we asked a little more closely, we said, what is your real problem? They said, see, the problem is not that we can't improve we can improve student performance but don't know how, or we can improve student performance but haven't been able to. The problem is that many of the factors that drive student performance are actually outside the department's control. The We have done this analysis and we find that the top factors, for example, that seem to influence it are the parents' demographics, their education and income level, and the factors that are in our control was really, really poor. So they said, by showing how the top factors are not related to educational policies, that's an action we can take. We can go back with a robust analysis and show that these factors have very little to do with what is in control of the education department. They could ask for support from other units to work in a concerted fashion. So we did that. In fact, one of the things that we found that was very surprising was that the second largest factor that had the largest impact on the students' marks was the month in which the child was born. There's absolutely nothing the department can do about the month in which the child is born. But if you look at the degree of impact on a scale of 1200, June bonds on average score the lowest, September bonds score the highest, and the difference is 120 out of 1200. 10 percentage points, and this difference is so large that it can take the topper down to the 33rd percentile. Now, this is not a one off. This happened in 2011, but when we did this analysis in data from 2009 and 2010, it showed pretty much the same kind of curve. We also broke it up by district, same pattern. We broke it up by subject, same pattern. We broke it up by gender, same pattern. Any which way we slice the data, it is exactly the same pattern. And you probably have guessed what's happening here, and you may have read about it in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. Age is the factor here. Malcolm Gladwell talks about how a similar phenomenon happened in the Canadian junior hockey team. They had an age cutoff saying anyone who turns 10 on January the 1st is eligible. So let's say there's a child who's born on January the 2nd, and it's January the 1st, just a day before their 10th birthday. And the coach says, no, you're not 10 years old, you're 9 years, 364 days old. Therefore, come back next year. The next year, the child is almost 11 years old. And at that age, a 12-month gap is huge. They're more mature physically and emotionally and tend to do better. And as a result, 4 years later, when the Canadian junior hockey team recruits for football players, for hockey players, why would they recruit for football players? When the Canadian junior hockey team is recruiting for players, they would invariably find the best players are those that are born in the months of January, February, and March. The same thing's happening here. The schools have an admission cutoff around July. So, what's happening here is that the June bonds invariably miss that cutoff. make the cutoff. They are by end July, they are 6 years and a month old. July bonds could go either way depending on the exact date of school admission. August bonds invariably miss the cutoff, and September bonds almost always miss the cutoff. As a result, these end up joining the next year when they're almost a year older than the rest of their classmates. And the impact is that there is a 10 percentage point improvement in their marks. Let's edit out that last section, please. What we find is that these children are invariably the oldest in the class, and that leads to a 10 percentage point improvement in their overall marks. Taking this further, what we could also see was that if we plot the number of children whose birthdays are on January the 1st, January the 2nd, and so on up to the end of January, and from January to December, and count where there are more birthdays, that's the darker blue color, and where there are fewer birthdays, that's the lighter blue color, we find a pattern that there are very few children who say they are born in the month of August. And the majority of the births seem to be reported in May, June, and a reasonable number in July, but it clearly dramatically drops off in August. What's happening here? Well, we dug a little deeper and found that since the schools are opening in July, if a child misses the cutoff, the parents have a couple of options. One, wait for 11 months, or fudge the dates. And one of the things that strengthened our confidence that the dates are being fudged is because you see these dark stripes on the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 20th, the 25th. When people cook up numbers, they cook up round numbers. And these are kids that have been brought in early, so whose birth dates might have been, let's say, August the 18th or October the 22nd or whatever. And to get them into school early, they've been brought in into June the 10th, July the 20th, and so on. This has an adverse impact on their school performance. So, what we actually find, I'll repeat that sentence. This has an adverse effect on the student's performance. What we find is that children who say they are born on the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 20th, the 25th, they tend to score much lower on average. And that's not because there's anything numerologically wrong with any of these dates, but because there's a higher proportion of younger kids who have been brought in into these dates and are suffering as a result. So, what the education department was able to do with this was to show the other departments that policies around school opening and age cutoffs can have an adverse impact, and started working with teams to see how this could be brought in a more holistic approach to ensure that education is driven not purely by the curriculum, but even by factors like the child's age and how well they are able to learn. Let me give you a few more examples from real life. This is for Adam, who is the purchasing head of a leading European brewery. The situation Adam found himself in was that he had plants that had purchased commodities for the brewery from several vendors. Discounts were really low, even though they are purchasing so many commodities, because they were buying them from several vendors. The, each vendor was giving a relatively low discount. And the number of times they were placing orders with these vendors was really high. They would order 3 times a week, 5 times a week, sometimes 10 times a week. And the problem was he didn't know which plants and commodities were ordering many times a week, where the discounts were really low. And when he spoke to every plant, they were denying it. The action that he could take was, if he could figure out where there were multiple orders and multiple vendors, he could consolidate the vendors and reduce the order frequency. And watch that, what that would do is increase their discounts and reduce their logistics cost. By framing it this way, it's possible that you can solve a problem that is relevant. In other words, it has an explicit impact, and you know how it has an impact, and you know what you need to do to get to that impact. Another example, cargo delay. So here, the audience is Christina, who's the operations head of a leading US airline. And she has a service level agreement that she has to deliver cargo from the flight, the time when the flight lands, to the warehouse in less than 1.5 hours. And that's 15% lower than their current best performance. Her problem is that she doesn't know where the biggest drivers of this delay are. Is it that I don't have the right people and improving that will have the biggest impact? Is it that I don't have the right cargo equipment? Is it that I'm shipping the wrong type of cargo? What should I change so that I'll have the best impact on this? And based on that, what she can do is she can add resources only to the largest lever of delay. So if it's assets, she'll buy more forklifts. If it's people, she'll train more people. But rather than wasting time on something that doesn't have the right kind of impact, she's not going to be able to do anything. And the net result of this is that the overall turnaround time will go down, but with a much lesser budget than otherwise. Otherwise, the alternative is that she asks for everything and that budget does not get approved. Yet another example, Ravi, who's the marketing manager in an Asian telecom company, he found that the cost of replacing customers is 3x the cost of retention. So, as far as this mobile company goes, they'd much rather retain a customer than reacquire another customer. But the trouble is, he doesn't know, and this is the problem, he doesn't know which customers to make an offer to in order to retain them. If Ravi can predict which customer is likely to churn, in other words, which customer is most likely to leave their network for a competitor, that's the action that he could take, that prediction, then the impact is that they could tailor a retention offer and reduce that overall reacquisition cost. He could specifically give those customers most likely to churn a retention offer. And that means that their cost of acquisition is lowered. They are able to retain more people, and the net impact of that reacquisition, the budget for that, comes down really low. All of these were examples of how you can discover the problem. Start by writing down who the person is, in what role, what their situation is, what their problem is, what action they can take, and what impact it's going to be. And you'll have a robust starting point for the rest of your data science journey.